When someone thinks about the Soviet Union and its music, the first thing that might come to mind is the beloved classical pieces of composers such as Shostakovich, Sviridov, and Prokofiev. Maybe it's the now turned meme Red Choir. If you were alive in the 80s, maybe it was Gorky Park's anthemic hair metal hit Bang. Although all of these things make up the Soviet musical culture, there was another form of music that played a big role in shaping modern Eastern European musical identity. When I think Soviet Union, one of the first things that come to my mind is definitely post-punk music. The story of Soviet post-punk begins in the region of Sverdlovsk, which is the modern-day Yekaterinburg. For those unaware of this place, this is the home city of Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin. Sverdlovsk was far from being the Soviet Union's most liberal region or anything of that sort. However, through sheer luck perhaps, the first taste of Soviet post-punk came from this region on the eastern side of the Ural Mountains. The whole story is quite bizarre knowing the context of how post-punk came about in the West. If UK or American post-punk music came from bands who got tired of playing 3-chord punk tunes, hence the word punk in the genre's name, Soviet Union's post-punk roots came from a completely different genre. May I present to you Sonans, the first Soviet post-punk band, a band that originally played progressive rock. Sonans was the first band to put Sverdlovsk on the map. The band got big by playing chamber prog covers of Russian 20th century classical pieces, as well as some original material here and there. The band's sound was changed in 1980, however, when one of the band members got an illegal copy of Gary Newman's debut album. The rest was history. Sonans managed to achieve two big things that year. They were one of the first underground Soviet bands to record an EP in good quality, and perhaps accidentally were the first band to start playing post-punk music in the country. EP still sounds really good to this day. Sonans definitely opted for a more robotic and artsy approach to post-punk, one that was influenced more by krautrock than say funk, reggae, or the original punk music. Not all members of the band were thrilled about the new wonky sound, so Sonans disbanded into two rival projects. One was the conventional but really well crafted heavy art rock band Urfen Juice, and the other, the one we are more interested in right now, was Trek. Trek continued developing the post-punk sound previously heard in Sonans. The quirky krautrock elements were merged with darker theatrical ones. Trek became a mysterious sensation that obviously caught the attention of the authorities and press. Trek was one of the first Soviet bands to have had hit pieces written about them. Journalists would discourage the Soviet public from attending their shows and owning their tapes. The authorities didn't have to worry, however, since Trek would soon disband themselves, splitting into even more underground bands that continued to perform in various alternative styles throughout the 80s. Meanwhile, Sverdlovsk was figuring out how the whole post-punk thing worked off a single Gary Newman record. Another Soviet region was making massive leaps forward. This was the Baltic country of Latvia and its capital city of Riga. Latvia's sound was even artsier than Sverdlovsk and much more focused on electronics. Before becoming the capital of Soviet techno, Latvia could be rightfully called the birthplace of Soviet minimal wave and minimal synth. On the more conventional side was Dzeltenie Pastnieki. The funkiest of early Soviet post-punk bands. Their albums would be considered to be some of the best that the Baltics have to offer, and they still remain to be a cult underground band to this day. On the weirder side was NSRD, the band that walked a fine line between electronics and crazy avant-garde music. The band utilized cheap Soviet synthesizers to the very extreme, creating some truly haunting and one-of-a-kind pieces. Leningrad is usually considered to be the home of the dark and melancholic post-punk music that we usually associate the Soviet scene with. However, you would be quite surprised to find out that one of the first bands in the scene was the humorous art punk band Странные Игры. Странные Игры, or Strange Games as they're known in English, would only record 2 albums, but they would test the time as absolute Soviet classics. The music was eclectic, but unlike the Sverdlovsk or Riga scene, fairly accessible. Led by the Soligu brothers, Strange Games would suck in all the small bits of Western music that they could get their hands on, and trust me, it wasn't much. The band said how, at the time, they mostly knew and listened to bands like Led Zeppelin and the Dire Straits. The most out there thing that they could get their hands on at the time was a couple of reggae discs and some Madness tracks. However, creative people don't need much, since the Strange Games managed to carve out an impressive melting pot of punk, ska, psychedelia, and weird Russian folk-fused reggae that I saw one person even consider to be proto-post-hardcore like. Not sure if I would go that far, but you get the idea. Important, legendary, cult band. Another band from the Leningrad scene that was heading towards an interesting post-punk sound was Coffee. Although the band's early work suffers from a lack of production, there are a lot of cool new wave melodies that the band would develop and perfect on their future record Balance.
Принцесса, мастер балета, фея шоколадной горы, плетью прыгает в карету.
Nowadays, there are more Leningrad rarities being released and discovered, and they deserve a video of their own. The last scene to make a significant splash in the pre-perestroika Soviet environment was the capital of Moscow. Unlike the other scenes, Moscow's underground environment was heavily monitored and censored by the secret services, so there was no possibility for a club like in Leningrad, or even a good sound quality on an album like Sverdlovsk. The bands had to utilize whatever equipment they could get their hands on and put their faith into the album format more than any other scenes, because playing shows was very unlikely. One of the first bands to make a name for themselves was DK, an acronym for House of Culture. DK was an art project started by Sergei Zharikov, meant to satirize Soviet realism and pop culture. Think Kamar and Melamit's art movement, but with music. Obviously, you can't satirize the 80s without at least a little bit of Joy Division worship. his approach was one of the more weird, sleazy, and nasty in the Soviet Union. This truly underground phenomenon would capture the hearts of many future Soviet bands and artists, from avant-garde jazz pianist Sergei Kuryohin to Siberia's Igor Letov. Another Moscow scene band of interest is Otrяд Имени Валерия Chkalova. Try saying that 5 times in a row. The band produced lo-fi home-recorded attempts at what was a mix of soft-cellish new wave pop and minimalistic dark wave. The darker tracks are the clear highlights for me here personally.
ВВС. Военно-воздушные силы. ВВС. Сфера особого внимания. ВВС.
Perhaps the biggest band in Moscow at the time was Vasily Shumov's Center. The band's name came from the Moscow-based slang word for cool. Originally, Center was a 50s rock and roll covers band centered around the likes of Little Richard and Chuck Berry, but soon they gravitated towards more modern music. The band's earlier work saw Center attempting at synthesizing 50s rock and roll with 80s alternative tweeness and punk stage antics. After the passing of Andropov and Chernenko came Gorbachev. Perestroika and Glasnost was announced, which meant that now there was more room for creativity and art in the Soviet Union. This is where things pick up a pace. With Perestroika and Glasnost, the opportunity to perform independent music became much easier, and various regions of the USSR took this chance to develop their own unique music scene. As before, Leningrad was the best developing region when it came to music. Perestroika gave a chance for the Leningrad bands to make ties in connection with Western artists, labels, and businesses, which significantly improved the conditions in the scene. Thanks to people such as John Stingray, for example, some Leningrad bands got better instruments, recording studios, and so on. The music in Leningrad was extremely varied at that time. Some notable bands include Televizor, fronted by the charismatic Mikhail Barzikin and one of the most openly political new wave bands at the time, Igri, one of the first bands to really nail the dark romanticism in post-punk music, Младшие братья, post-punk with elements of Django pop and early indie music, Народные ополчения, outsider art punks turned dance punk. Петля Нестерова. One of the best guitar tones in the scene. Дурное влияние. Leningrad's most legendary gothic rock band, Yugo-Zapad. Another band famous for their political lyrics, this time utilizing alternative and garage rock as means of transporting their message. Кино.
Закрой за мной дверь, я ухожу. Закрой за мной дверь, я ухожу.
The most commercially successful Soviet post-punk band of all time, Ole Lukoye. The band would become more well known for their progressive folk and tribal ambient experiments in the 1990s. However, early on they made some really catchy new wave music. Besides the more straightforward post-punk bands and indie groups, more sophisticated and experimental collectives started forming in Leningrad. These would include most famously Auktion, one of the most original bands in the country, as well as Brillianti od Neckermana,
Моя детка, бай-бай.
Stereo Soldat, Avia,
Там уже этот ты, Бомбей, ушел очень далеко.
Среднерусская возвышенность. Many Brezhnev era bands continued putting out monster hits, keeping hold of their legendary and cult status. One of the biggest symbols of perestroika was the official opening of the Moscow Rock Laboratory in 1986. This gave Russia's capital its own place and home to play music and rival the much more experienced Leningrad rock club. Almost overnight, Moscow went from one of the more dead scenes to being overfilled with alternative and post-punk related bands. A lot of the Moscow bands focus more on the experimental and atmospheric side of music, utilizing heavy psychedelic and cold wave influences to make albums that were both dark but catchy. Some of the most notable bands include Nikolai Kopernik, Ночной проспект, НИИ Косметики, Биоконструктор,
Он синтезирует способы.
Альянс. Perhaps the most legendary and cult band of this era would be Zvuki Mu. A band that synthesized tragic humor with apocalyptic post-punk music. A lot of the Moscow bands saw big commercial success, and as a result, the local music journalists started putting them up against the already established Leningrad scene. The result was a small but fun rivalry amongst the two scenes. The Moscow bands would throw shots at the Leningrad bands for not sounding good enough. Meanwhile, the Leningrad bands would criticize Moscow's ethos and commercialization of alternative music. There were, however, bands who couldn't care less about these things. One of them was Obermaniken, a Leningrad-based psychedelic new wave band that moved to Moscow after Perestroika. Another example was the band Alisa, who were formed in Leningrad but fronted by a Moscow singer Konstantin Kinchev. Alisa would become extremely popular in the Soviet Union due to the band's eclectic mix of dark atmospheric post-punk and anthemic hard and heavy. This small rivalry would culminate in entertaining Soviet music programs shown on the TV. The two most legendary would be the Telemos concert Moscow-Leningrad, which would spawn some of the most cult-tape performances of Soviet bands out there. Another famous show was the Moscow vs. Leningrad performance at the Musical Ring program. Musical Ring was basically a big battle of the bands type of contest that would be shown on Soviet television. The show usually featured a well-established and respected Soviet artist put up against the newer, lesser-known one get their exposure. The end of the Moscow vs. Leningrad program resulted with Leningrad winning 2-1, but at the end of the day, what matters is the great music, and both scenes absolutely delivered that day. Although Leningrad and Moscow got the biggest amount of attention, we can't forget about the scene that had started it all. Sverdlovsk didn't stop producing music. Far from it, the scene continued developing further, embracing its distinct prog-influenced new wave and post-punk sound. The biggest band to break out of Sverdlovsk was Nautilus Pompilius. Formed out of the Track and Oof and Juice crowd, Pompilius constantly searched for new and interesting sounds, from minimal wave to sophisti-pop and even Slavic folk rock. What separated Nautilus Pompilius from a lot of other bands at the time was their openness to experiment with pop-friendly music styles, while retaining strong political lyrics that you would rarely find in music that wasn't some super underground punk or folk band.
Можно верить и в отсутствие веры, можно делать и отсутствие дела. Нищие молятся на то, что их нищета гарантирована. Здесь можно играть про себя на трубе, но как не играй, все играешь отбой. И если есть те, кто приходит к тебе, найдутся и те, кто придет за тобой.
Nautilus Pompilius was extremely big and would soon garner the attention of music snobs that called them your housewife's favorite Soviet rock band. This didn't discourage Nautilus Pompilius though, as they would keep pumping out decade-defining hits one after the other. Less popular but just as great Sverdlovsk bands are, for example, Aprilski Marsh, Agatha Christie, Cabinet, смысловые галлюцинации, Association, Beat Bardak. And one of my personal favorite Sverdlovsk bands, NSRD. One of the most cult underground scenes was formed in Izhevsk, an industrial city known for the culture of the Udmurt people and in the more modern Soviet times as the place where AK-47s were first manufactured. Retelling the entire story of Izhevsk in one video is really hard to do, but due to a couple of circumstances, one of which involved a Soviet checkers champion playing in global tournaments, the region of Izhevsk was introduced to bands and artists like Coil, Nurse with Wound, Throbbing Gristle, and the Cocktail Twins in a span of a year. These new Western sounds blew the minds of the Izhevsk youth, and soon a new artistic movement started boiling underneath. The first Izhevsk band was called BM, and played in traditions of the Latvian minimal wave scene.
Мы увидим дорогу в бессмертие дел, разожжем свой костер и согреем друзей всех своих. Хоть на час.
What separated Izhevsk was their love for the abstract and weird. It's not surprising that later in the 90s the scene would mostly focus on IDM and various sorts of electronic genres. Despite that, the scene's roots are still based in post-punk and new wave music. Some notable bands include Stuk Bambuka,
Здравствуй, здравствуй, я вижу тебя, ландыш. Ручей сошелся мой пульс, мне удалось отыскать тебя, ландыш.
perhaps the most legendary and famous Izhevsk band. Their atmospheric music videos would win awards on Soviet television. Samtsy Dronta, a really Lynchian band that combined dream pop and ethereal wave with brooding darkness of a gothic rock band. Velvet and Velvet Doll. Usually widely considered to be one of the first and only Soviet shoegaze bands. Although many parts of the USSR were enjoying the benefits of perestroika, the artists in Chelyabinsk 70 were not that lucky. This was an extremely secretive place, one guarded by the secret services. Did that stop the people from making music? No. Biggest band from this region would be Vova Blue and the Brothers of the Mind, a cult band to say the least. This band was pretty much the only non-Moscow and Leningrad band to have had their music played by John Peel himself. Vova Blue and the Brothers of the Mind weren't the first band in Chelyabinsk. One of their biggest influences was a minimal wave band called the Bad Boys.
Я супермен, твои погоны удачно заменяют мозги. Мои сапоги блестят так ярко, что вокруг не видно низги.
Bad Boys started making music before Perestroika, but even after Gorbachev's program, the band was harassed by the secret services and would end up breaking up due to the pressure. Отклонение от нормы played fun, sleazy post-punk. The band only managed to perform one concert before being forced to break up by the local authorities. Post-punk, new wave, synth-pop and indie music was practically everywhere, even in closed-off areas like Chelyabinsk 70. By the late 80s, new wave and even punk imagery was becoming normalized in the Soviet media. You now had TV shows like Program A broadcasting skinny puppy videos.
Называется Skinny Puppy, что значит тощий щенок.
Sonic Youth performing in Kiev, and the Baltics would release their first share of Western indie albums, including bands such as the Pixies. With these changes in the environment came a change in the underground ethos. In other words, bands got the opportunity to make a little bit more money. Yes, you still had an underground rebellious scene in Leningrad and Sverdlovsk, but now some bands were treated better than others in the community. For some bands, the change was a size one. Nautilus Pompilius and Elisa started selling out stadiums instead of small venues. For some, however, it also meant a chance to ease up the sound for potential radio listeners and frequent Melodia buyers. Unsatisfied with the commercially unappealing music Auktion was making, Sergei Rogoshkin would join the much more commercial synth-pop band Forum. Members of the Moscow synth-punk band Zona Aktivnosti would abandon their sound to churn out Italo-disco-esque club numbers under the new band name Mirage. Underground press started noticing a trend in the commercialization of the music, and soon phrases like Soviet punk is dead started pouring. It was clear that the USSR needed a new scene, one that was not like the rest, one that was radical, uncompromising, offensive and nasty. Hooked up on the Butthole Surfers' birthday party and 60s psychedelia came the Siberian punk wave. Many people consider this scene to be the greatest in all of USSR. Say what you want about the ranking of musical quality, Siberia was the radical breath of fresh air that Soviet Union needed. Siberian punk scene based mostly around the regions of Omsk, Tyumen, and Novosibirsk. The Siberian punk sound was rooted mainly in three musical genres, those being noise rock, Soviet Via, and lastly 60s garage rock. The main reasons for this unique blend of genres was due to a man by the name of Igor Letov. Letov was one of the edgiest contrarians in the Soviet underground scene. Not only was he critical of the government, but throughout his career he would be completely ruthless towards his underground peers.
Советский рок вообще как бы не слушаю, потому что там слушать, собственно говоря, нечего, позорное дело.
Гражданская оборона was one of the hardest working bands in the underground, releasing up to 5 and more albums in the span of a year, with every release the band getting angrier and angrier.
Свято место не бывает, чистоте с братным ветром затопили берега. Кто не любит новый порядок, кто не верит в новый порядок, кто не жаждет новый...
Гражданская оборона would become an extremely polarizing band in the underground circles, with a lot of the Moscow elite and journalists not understanding the angry lyrical content and noise rock music style. Famous Soviet music journalist Artemy Troitsky would dismiss Гражданская оборона as gopnik music.
Не со стороны его как бы целевой аудитории. То есть основная аудитория Егора Летова, вот я помню прекрасно еще по концу 80-х годов, по началу 90-х, это были гопники, такие радикальные гопники. Они очень любили гражданскую оборону.
Although the critics might have hated it, the people absolutely loved it. By the early 90s, a raw noise rock band like Гражданская оборона managed to rival the most commercial of Soviet rock bands. Although the Moscow crowd didn't really understand Siberian punk and Гражданская оборона, the band found love in Sverdlovsk and especially in Leningrad. For example, Auktion will lend Oborona their practice spot when they came to tour there. At some point, Letov would open up his own homemade studio and, in a way, indie label called Grob Records. Letov's main goal was to get all the bands to make the most dissonant, noisy, and anti-mainstream music possible. Some of the bands and artists involved would be Armia Vlasova, also known as Anarchia, Цыганята и Ясы Ильича, Янка, Черный Лукич, инструкция по выживанию, спинки мента, Кузяо,
Стоя посреди, не зная где и что там, не видя ничего, не чувствуя себя. Так больно думать, что нигде и почему-то бледнеет черный свет и тает на глазах.
And last but not least, the Siberian punk supergroup Communism, which combined Igor Letov, Kuzyaо, and Oleg Sudakov of Цыганята fame. For those who aren't big fans of having their eardrums blasted with lo-fi Siberian noise, don't worry, as the scene was much more varied than one might first think. Besides the already mentioned noise rock leaning artists, there was Budnili Prozorya, frantic art punk band similar to Leningrad's Auktion, but grimier. Bomsh. A Siberian answer to DK of sorts. Закрытое предприятие. Stylish dark new wave of the Depeche Mode kind. Big Klaxon. Originally started out as an amazing indie folk band, soon they turned to something resembling the British alternative rock scene at the time. Промышленная архитектура.
Радость плоти с каждым днем больше смысла срезать корку.
Soviet answer to Pill, in a way. The story of the Soviet post-punk and alternative scene could be talked about for hours and hours. New scenes were popping up one by one across the country. Estonia was experiencing its second punk and indie boom at the time. There was the art punk crowd in Rostov-na-Donu. One of my personal favorites was the Georgian scene at the time. And let's not forget the absolutely legendary Ukrainian Novaya Scena movement. These are still pretty big and notable locations, not taking into account what was happening in Kazan. Vladivostok. Kaliningrad.
Мы опять попали, уставший бродяга, ты рядом со мной, ты во мне.
Irkutsk. Kazakhstan. And many other places.
И книга не лезет в нервную ткань. Я просто смотрю в темноту из окна. Адидасом растоптанный город спит. Jeigu viskas tik tai blogai, nesijaudink, lauk. Laukti, lauk, laukti, lauk, laukti, lauk.
After a series of events that included various regions protesting for independence, economic problems, and lastly the events of the GKCHP, the country known to the world as the Soviet Union finally ceased to exist. Usually these stories end with some quote about how the Cold War was over with the communists losing and now everybody in the Eastern Bloc could live happily ever after. But what happened to all those bands and artists from the past? What happened to the music? The new exciting but at the same time violent and dangerous environment of Russia resulted in the music getting much heavier and angrier. Now renamed to St. Petersburg, the Leningrad scene gravitated more towards post-hardcore and various forms of folk music for some reason. Moscow was going through its cocaine and party years without any reminiscence of the past atmospheric post-punk music they were making. Siberian punk bands had practically ceased to exist after the fall of the USSR, but the few that remained intact would continue exploring their garage rock side mostly. Ijevsk would delve into various experimental projects and, as I already mentioned, do a lot of IDM related stuff. The Baltics would get overrun by metal bands. Pretty much the only scene that would continue playing in new wave and post-punk adjacent style of music was Yekaterinburg, aka Sverdlovsk, mostly thanks to the band Agatha Christie breaking out into the mainstream during the mid-90s. This is not taking into account all the smaller scenes where the bands couldn't survive due to the economic turmoils and violence in the areas. It seems like post-punk and new wave had finally run its course in the Eastern European region. So this marks the end of this video. There's still a ton of information, deep cuts and stories that need a retelling, so I will come back to this topic again in future videos. Yeah, this was a video that I hope informed some of you on a couple of new bands. Yeah, please leave a like on the video and subscribe for more in-depth content in the future. Yeah, all the links to songs will be found in the description, as well as a Spotify playlist will be shared somewhere, probably also in the description, but might be in the comments. Yeah, and this is my first ever video attempt at making a video, so I'm sorry for if the sound isn't too good, you know, the video doesn't look that great. I'm learning while I'm doing this. Feel free to share your favorite Soviet post-punk bands in songs, albums in the comments below, because sharing is one of the key reasons why I made this channel, and I'm always interested in finding out cool new music. Yeah, that's all. Goodbye.